Howdy. I'm just going to do a quick check, make sure the mic is on. Looks like it is. Cool. Here we are at the very last set of these series of classes designed to tell you how I sort of made this flyer right here. We've gone through basic modeling in low poly modeling. Ooh, look at my messy hair. We've gone through basic rigging. We've gone through basic animation and animation technique. And now we're going to do all the final touches, which is shading, UV editing, rendering, and if we have time, even just the final exporting process, which is pretty much rendering. We're not going to go into the compositing I did later on when I brought this into After Effects and did a little special stuff to do these eyeballs and all this fun stuff. I'll mention it, but I'll mention what I did specifically to bring it into other programs. But we're primarily going to just tell you how to bring out your animations. In terms of sending this stuff into Unity, I believe I have classes on that in our YouTube Histories channel, but I will try to touch on it. But bringing this into Engine, it's not super complex, especially with Blender. You can literally drag Blender files into Unity. I'm not sure about Unreal. Usually I work with Maya when I do stuff in Unreal, but that's just because there are some plugins specifically that work very well between the two of them. But for this, I'm mostly doing this to render, and so if you want to look at the rest of the process, I assure you it's pretty easy. For the most part, you can drag it in. Anyways, unlike the other classes where we would sort of go through the entire process, we will be doing some of that, but most of this will be more oriented on simply what I did, how those things sort of achieved the effects they want to, potentially how you can do them yourself, but it won't be sort of a construct it and follow along course like the past three. This is me mostly going to be going through a series of things to tell you why I did it and what effect they did. So without further ado, let me bring up our final product. So this was essentially the final render cleaned up. It's in the Game Jam Central part of our Discord if you want the files to go through it. But I'm going to go through all the various things here, why this is the way it is, and what that sort of meant for me to accomplish what I wanted to with this. So if we press play, we're going to see a whole bunch here, including something we actually can't see because it's part of the fluid simulation, so it doesn't render out. We're not going to go through the fluid simulation. I already said it before, like, for the most part, fluid simulation in Blender is a really neat and cool thing, especially for like a lot of, I guess, stuff you'd want to do, but with just basic rendering or making something simpler. But for game assets, I don't know how useful it is. This is definitely going at a lower frame rate, but you know, this is super dense. This has complete shading. If we actually change to this render mode, it'll improve pretty much immediately. But all that is to say, like, here's the final product. If you're new to Blender, these things up here are the various different ways you can render something out. This is wireframes, where it just brings your meshes down to their most key components, the vertices, the faces, and the edges that go between them. This is sort of meshes rendered as if those things took on normals but didn't take on shading or any sort of complex attributes that would give it color. This is colored but not properly lit, and this is lit, colored, and rendered in Eevee. We're going to be using Eevee for this particular render. We'll go into that later on, but there are two different types of rendering within Blender. There's Eevee, which is sort of a on-the-fly renderer, I think, that uses your GPU to sort of, almost like a game, sort of render at runtime, so it doesn't have to take time to render each frame out. And then there's actually Workbench as well. I never use Workbench. But there's also Cycles. And Cycles will take multiple passes of your render and try to, you know, every time you look at it, try to create something that is taking on light appropriately and is sort of trying to accumulate where these sort of rays are bouncing off between each other. If it looks weird right now, that like all this stuff sort of looks funky, that's simply because the shader style I used, the material shaders I used and created, work specifically with Eevee and don't work with cycles. They could be made to run with cycles. It is a simple ramp shader, and ramp shaders can be used in almost anything, but in this specific case, not going to happen. You can actually see some of the Eevee effect on this the Peach Grabber's lips over here. You can kind of see how over time the sort of fuzziness goes away and we get a clear render that actually is appropriately having light bounce off of it and where it should be bouncing off, and good rim lighting based on what we have around here. But as I said before, like, not how I try to build my shaders. Anyways, here it is once again in Eevee. If you were wondering why the sort of ground here has all the little checkerboard pattern, that is something I did deliberately. It does not start that way with Blender, but it is a setting you can put to make the film, quote, transparent. And the reason I would do that is because I wanted to bring this out as a rendered sequence that I could then put other images in the background. As you can see in the flyer, there's a whole bunch of other peaches floating down underneath it. So if we go to film in the little camera settings, a lot of these are, to me, I'm sure people smarter than I can tell you the exact sort of differentiations between them, but render properties, output properties, and actually these two, and maybe this one up here, will have a lot of your stuff that sort of deal with your final render. So we'll go to film and transparent. And if we turn that off, we can see the traditional sort of render here. But press F12, we bring up our render scene, and that is one scene rendered from our active camera. We'll go over that in a second. But let's just put on transparent, press F12 again, and we'll see that that checkerboard box remains, which means that when next time I actually save this image, the background will not be present, and it'll just be these things, and the rest of it will be portrayed as an alpha or transparency, which is really fun if you want to bring it into other programs and do some extra editing, like I did with this in After Effects and Aseprite. Anyways, that is that. Let's keep going and talk about other aspects of our sort of finalization process. First thing I want to bring up now, since we brought up our shading, Eevee, and rendering, is this sort of shading right here. The sort of hatch shading I've done on each one of these characters, and the stippling I've done on this one, and the sort of hatch marks here that sort of fade out and go into each other instead of creating a sort of traditional ramp 2D shader. So when I was doing this, I was reading Barefoot Gen, which is a very depressing but very fascinating manga that is based around Hiroshima at the sort of right before and during the events of the U.S. bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. And I think personally this is a absolutely gorgeous manga, but what really struck me when I was reading it were these really beautiful shading techniques that Keiji Nakazawa uses to sort of, I don't know, create depth in his scene. It's very artistic and very stylized in a way, and I'm going to find a good example here, and hopefully something that's also not too graphic, because this is a very sad manga as well, as you would imagine given the subject matter. So I'm going to try to find for you something that is very, okay, this will probably do. So if you look at the sun, we have these really beautiful sort of line work. Let's see if it'll pick it up. It kind of is. So the line work here is just super hatched and super interesting. And if we look at the sort of night sky and the one over here, similarly has these really nice hatch markings that I just wondered, I wondered if I could bring that into Unity. And I had already messed around with ramp shaders. Same with these little stipple marks on the bricks here. I don't know if they're selling because of the camera, but don't worry, there's just little dots on it, similar to the guy up here. And I want to know if I could bring that into Blender. And thanks to a tutorial, I was able to I guess, accurately ask for what I want to do, because I knew I want to do a ramp shader. What a ramp shader is, or cell shading, more, I guess, commonly referred to, is it sort of takes on the traditional properties. It tries to take the data of light in a program or a game or something like that and boil it down to just a certain amount of sort of layers of light. So instead of, I guess you can even see on my face right now how light sort of progresses and fades and has a gradient throughout my face and sort of hits certain spots directly, ramp shaders or cell shaders try to take that light and boil it down to maybe 3 or 2 colors. And so you have something that looks like a cartoon, because we're not going to be able to shade every single part of this otherwise. So if we go to shading up here on Blender, we can see, I don't know why this would ever run without it in this sort of perspective, the various shader graph properties I have underneath here. And what I'm going to hope to do right now is explain to you how most of these work. We're mostly going to be going and focusing on the stuff down here. Up here is sort of how we got this painterly effect, which is mostly sort of generated through noise and a color ramp here, but not as important as what I was trying to do here. This was just kind of the extra sort of icing on the cake that was mostly constructed with our tutorial. So first things first, let's see, if we go into UV editing, I think it's actually up there. I made this PNG here, which was just me sort of in Photoshop making a very simple sort of line effect. The only special thing I did was I made sure that it was tileable by simply matching the end vertices with each other on each one of these right at the end here, so it wouldn't have like a weird sort of cutoff effect on anything. And if we go back to shading, we have these mapped on texture coordinates for our hatches. And all of this primarily comes from the diffuse BSDF. And what that is essentially the initial shader property that takes on diffuse lighting and tells the program how to map lighting on a surface. We then make that into a color sort of setting, and we feed it into these. These over here will then take on our sort of hatched ink and hatched light ink settings, put those on certain sort of light spectrums, and over here I sort of create how much of that light spectrum I want to affect, right? So if I want the hatches to go really far from each other, I can put it all the way up here. If I want them to be very close, I can bring them very, very close to each other, so we have like a almost dithering effect. See, so like right here, we potentially have them blending right into each other. So there's a very dramatic sort of look to it. If we go into here, we can deal with how far back the shader like wants to make the ramp shader sort of feed into the light. If we move it over here, it kind of goes backwards, so it doesn't really work out. But I think you're beginning to get the idea. Essentially, we're taking light, and instead of using a gradient sort of to react to it, we are ascribing these two sort of textured properties, making them very dense and sort of putting them on top of each other to give a illustrated look to the shader instead of a sort of traditional one when we do cell shading. So I plan on sort of messing around this more in other projects. I plan on also bringing this into Unity, because a lot of these things are fairly similar and the principles can be definitely shared between the two things here. And when I'm done with this, I'll post a link to the particular tutorial I used to sort of go from an idea to conception here. But knowing basically how this stuff works can be super useful just in knowing what's possible for you down the line if you want to make sort of neat shaders like this. Honestly, I kind of wish I did this. I think this looks great. But that's how we get into there. And then once I made that shader, I applied it to pretty much everything in the scene. And if we look at him, I also did slight UV unwrapping. And UVs are essentially you creating another sort of coordinate space that the computer then tells this is where we want our sort of texture properties to be attributed on our model. So I'm going to show you what this UV looks like by just going into UV editing and pressing, oh yeah, this one should show up on here, but I don't think that's actually what we did to do the UV editing. Yeah, here we go. That's a UV for this guy. And we can kind of see it by looking at him, right? If we take our model and just click out, we can see our red seam going across. We can see that sort of reflected here. And inside of his mouth, we also create a seam, so his mouth is also represented as a separate seam. And because of that, light on this is mostly uniform and takes on a decent sort of property here. If we want to see how to do that, I'm going to go into our final thing we had for our last class, and we can see that it's not necessarily a smooth. We have not applied our UV yet, so it looks a little bit sort of sloppy. It doesn't necessarily know where the UV should be. I think if we go into UV editing, we won't even see it unwrapped yet because it's just trying to do it on the fly. So there's a couple things we can do in order to do that. If we're feeling very lazy, the easiest thing we can do is just go select all, UV unwrap, and hope that it gets it right. There's also UV Smart UV Project. Hope it gets it right. Truthfully, it does not often get it right, so it's not something we often do. Anyways, go back into edit mode. UV, let's just see. Okay. It actually does a very good job here. If we go into our UV editing, we can see that it's done a fairly admirable job, but it's kind of messed up in certain spaces. Like, I don't know why the head is so weirdly sort of configured. It looks like it did decide to cut out the mouth, but it didn't cut it out entirely, so it has these weird sort of things here. So let's undo that, and we're going to do just the same thing. I'm going to do it in animation just so we can have some like immediate results. Actually, let's just go to layout. And I like to actually do this in grayscale because it's just easier. And we're going to create a UV here. Going to turn on this. We can see that it goes pretty much to here, like right to the lip here. That's fine. We could also just take these out potentially because the inside of the mouth to me is not necessarily as important as the rest of the seams we'll be making. So I'm going to just highlight all this, and we're going to do a very easy seam, especially because we're not going to be looking at this from all angles, so our seam or where the UV marks will not be as visible. We'll go to edges, mark seam, and now we'll see the red line. And all that does is tell the computer, or I guess it tells Blender, rather, this is where I want a line in our UVs to be drawn. This is where I want my, I guess, toy or model to be cut up. Think of it like, I don't know if any of you have ever done sewing or stitching. You should. It's actually a really good skill to learn and can make you have clothing last way longer than before. But essentially, it's like where I'm telling it to make, like the seams in the clothing here. That's what I'm telling it to do. Anyways, I'm going to make one around the mouth as well. And so now when we go to UV editing, we can see this is its first attempt at doing it. We go to UV, unwrap. Oh, it's also doing that because it's selecting the lips. So let's actually, before we unwrap the UV. Alright, we have our old UV here. Just going to grab him, press A, and then UV unwrap. And that's our new one, which is mostly sort of secure. These two parts are looking very similar. They're not perfect. They're kind of sloppy UVs. We can actually play with the coordinates. We would normally play with the coordinates if we were doing traditional textured UVs. I can actually probably show you some of that at the end of this sort of tutorial series. But now that we've done that, let's look in our rendered scene, and we can see that these little stippled effects are hitting, for the most part, very well. There is a little bit of sort of funkiness right next to its lip because the things are very close. Sometimes that can be as simple as transformations that have not been applied. So what we can do for that is make sure that the object apply. I'm just going to do rotation and scale and see if that helps. It doesn't look like it helped a lot. Other things we can do, some are simple, just add a sort of subdivision here and it'll be a little smoother because the lighting just sort of knows what to do better. We'll see if that's what I did in the other one, but that's the basics of doing a very simple UV to make sort of shading effects work better. It also worked for texturing, but it's not necessarily, like, these are just how you make UVs. This isn't how you make a good UV, so to speak, and there are countless things that you can learn about making UVs. UVs are definitely a rabbit hole that one can go into indefinitely. It is a very complex process that, you know, I admire people who make nice, tight, good UVs because it takes time and patience to really get good at it. And, you know, I might be able to show, I think, some where I kind of really started learning how to make good UVs, but I'll also just show you guys a well thought out UV later on. Anyways, let's go back to our final render now that we've talked about UVs. So here's our final render. He's cleaned up. His UVs are clean. Looks like, just look at his UV and see what they looked like anyway. So same shit. The only thing that's different is I brought the lip in a little bit more. That could be why that we have our sort of tighter shading there, but it's in there. Our animation is baked. We already went over animation, so don't worry about that. And there they are, all hopping around. The water stuff gets rendered at runtime, so don't worry about it not being visible here. If we press F12, there it is being rendered right now. Let's see. So the way that I set up my program was sort of to figure out how I wanted to render everything. We can see that I have a lot of cameras here. If we change which one is my active camera, we can see basically what I was trying to do here. So let's go to, maybe not rendering, we'll just go to layout. So if we go view, cameras, set active object as camera, and then we can go and see, well, me trying to find the right perspective for this particular shoot. So was it this camera that I wanted to use? You know, maybe not. Oh, yeah, I can just click here. Is this the angle I wanted? I didn't like the type here. Maybe not. Is this the angle? It's a little bit too far off to the side. Also, let's just disable these so we can see what I had. But at the same time, I was also playing with the peaches location. And this was before I had rendered the peach out in a different way. And we can try to find out where I put the peach then. But ultimately, no, I didn't settle with this. So, no, that's not the path I want. And then, this is the one I put on a rail. And sort of, when I knew I wanted to animate it, I knew that the easier way of maybe getting a consistent camera location was to use the camera rather than just use one specific spot, and use a sort of tracking shot that sort of exhibited the various motions and got you a better look at the models. And like, if it's in 3D, why not make it in 3D and, you know, sort of transfer some of the motion and fun into this and make it sort of mesmerizing and hypnotic with the peach in the background. So what I did here is I took our rendering camera out of the various rendering cameras I used, finally settled on which one of these peaches I wanted, and I attached it to a NURBS path, which you can create by just going to add, curve, and I think for this one I did a circle and just moved it around. Adding subdivisions where I thought that it should move and changing the sort of places along the Bezier path that made sense. If we wanted to like make it funkier, we can do that. And if we go into our camera, oopsie, we can just go view, camera, active camera. We can now see that it takes sort of a bigger dive because I changed the NURBS path. If we undo it, oh, we can see that we kind of go back up and we have the smoother path. Within our My Modifiers, not for the camera path, but for the camera itself, I believe exists how that works, or I might have just already baked it in. Let me see. Because typically, since I did it this way, it must be in object mode or something like that. There we go, it's on the Bezier path. I had to look up how to do this because I had not done it in Unity or Blender before, but essentially, you can fix the camera along a path, have a fixed sort of object, and I'll post the tutorial I think I had for this as well, and give it an object to focus on. Its object it's focusing on is this peach right here, and as it moves along, it will slowly sort of tilt and make sure that it's always the center of the camera. So we're always looking at the same thing, locked into the perspective of what we want. So not only is it moving, but it's also tracking. I think it's tracking and panning, technically. Tracking being the camera technique. If it's on a sort of set of rails or something like that, it's when a camera goes like this. Panning is when it does that. Old film school stuff. Been in school for so long. Of course, I've at some point been in film school. And that's sort of how we get the sort of technique we wanted here. And have a more dynamic sort of camera flow when we moved around here. So once we rendered everything, let me bring up the sort of rendered out object. When you render something in almost any 3D stuff, it won't usually render as like a GIF or something like that. It instead renders as a series of images. Give me 1 second while I find out where I actually rendered this thing, because it becomes sort of a very large. Yeah, there we are. So it renders into a series image for each frame, and we can see it here, 33 and onward, right? And every time we do this, we get another image that we then render out. And that means we have to bring it into potentially another program to sort of composite it into a video or a GIF or whatever. For this particular one, I brought it into After Effects. We'll actually see an old build, I think, if we look at the... I've been to Aseprite just to sort of get a good idea of what it would look like. So let's wait while Aseprite loads up. So actually we can open recent and that'll be fine. Oh, yeah, I forgot. I also did this, that's how I rendered this at such a low. Let me just open Aseprite. Usually if we open Aseprite the normal way, it'll sort of go through our recent projects, and I can find, it looks like a lot of that might have just literally been deleted. Let's see. So NMGD000.asc is the one we just did. I might have actually cleaned up after myself for once. Good for me. But yeah, essentially we took these into here. This was the final product in After Effects that was brought into here. I do wonder where I saved him though, because I did indeed save this constantly in here. Oh, I think that's the reason why. If we go into our K folder, where did I save you? I think it should be in our models. HDM render. Well, actually, let's do it the way I did. I'm pretty sure that, yeah, it'll say that do these following files are animation because it's used to seeing animations as a sequence of PNGs. We'll agree. And we already know how it renders technically because we can see that in Blender. We can just, press play on the animation tab. And this is every frame playing at a different sort of frame rate than it normally does. And if we want to get closer to our frame rate, we can just approximate the constant frame rate here. I saw that 30 was usually pretty much around the mark, if not a little slow. and I can get a good idea of what it looks like with its transparency in the background. This is little extra. I thought that this just might be a fun thing to see. What was fun later on was bringing the final After Effects file into here, and finding out that if we indexed our color palette over here, which you can do in Photoshop, you can do in a lot of things, it's just I feel like Aseprite did a pretty admirable job at this. We were able to get the file size down so incredibly minuscule that this flyer here was only, I think, 4 megabytes, which for a GIF with that many frames, I think is fairly incredible. Yeah, this is all going pretty fast, huh? Anyways, let's see. What's our next thing that we want to go through? I'm going to go back to our file. We went through our camera, we went through our shader, we went through our UVs, and we went through how all that stuff works and how we created it. I'll be posting links to a lot of the stuff afterwards. So shading, rendering, UVs, cameras. Let's just look at the renderer stuff. So F12 brings you to render. If we wanted to render an animation, we have to go to render animation, and then we'll sit here and wait as it goes through every single frame one by one by one. It goes to an output folder of our own specification. Typically, you just want to make sure that it saves to a certain name or something like that. But this is a long and hasty process. It's just not a lot of fun. Our water domain, we could look at this. I forgot to actually move the water around, so you can see that the water kind of comes out of this little guy. Water, so the fluid simulation basically makes a whole bunch of tiny particles that take on physics properties and have a sort of plasticity based on how many particles are near it, whether or not it'll sort of stay in shape or form. You can kind of see it as things move around, that if certain particles are close to each other, they sort of create a globule. And that also takes forever to render, and that took so long for this to actually render correctly and loop well. It was a real nightmare. But yeah, if you want to mess around with fluid rendering stuff, I would totally kind of encourage it, but like, don't do it for anything with a deadline. Do it for fun. I really wasted a lot of time in there trying to get just the perfect render, and honestly, as it turns out, I don't think there is. Anyways, I'm going to show you guys some of things I'm working on right now, mostly as it pertains to how I'm trying to create, or how good UVs sort of typically look. I think this is a model from Persona. I think it's actually from 4 or 5, but this is an exquisitely done low poly model. Very, very, like, every detail just meticulously sort of gone after, and really making the most out of each quad possible. You'll notice that some of these are not technically quads, but for the most part, those that aren't technically quads, the only reason they aren't is probably because the sort of tries to quad stuff that I used didn't work out. But if we look at their texture and how the UVs are implemented, they don't necessarily look like that, but that's fine. That's something we can do in our UV editing process, is we can sort of move and match these vertices to make more sense when we actually sort of put it together. So if we want something to fit a pant leg, we can take the edges of these, and it won't deform the vertices within our actual model, and it will sort of follow along our mesh and create a tighter, cleaner sort of attachment to what we're working with. And this stuff is super good and super useful to learn from. I think I used the models resource to grab all these. This is going to be something that at the end of the jam, hopefully you'll see. But yeah, this is essentially just a very cleaned up UV. And for the most part, you can see the seams that they created. It's what these blue guys are, but these seams are also edge creases, and like, this is kind of, for me, like, how you really create a beautiful and good looking UV, and really work within your art assets to make something that really, like, makes your model look more 3D than it really is. Because if we look at those sort of polygonal shapes here, this is, like, if we put on shade flat, this isn't smooth, right? This is a blocky 3D man. But almost as if they used normal maps, and they didn't. This is hand drawn. Just these sort of meticulously well-groomed UVs, along with just very good polyflow and very good modeling, gives us a model that like looks way more 3D than it really is. Except for the face. Faces are always like this. Faces are typically very, very complex. Also, these are all in tries because most renderers will output tries to quads no matter what you do. If we want them to be quads to tries, rather, you can just do tries to quads and we can see a better idea of how this was sort of constructed here. Face modeling is super complex. It's hard to get like a low poly face or like a low poly face. Insofar as you have to really accommodate for like the level of mesh deformation with every sort of facial emotion you do. It's not as easy as your legs or your arms, where you can hide a lot of stuff in just simple clothing, or just, you know, the sort of folds in our arms aren't necessarily that deformed as opposed to the ones in our face when we talk. So typically face sort of modeling will be a lot more difficult. But again, look at this wonderful UV editing. In particular, like only using half of the face is so smart. Like they just mirrored the UV. So they don't have to use both. They could just layer the UV over each other and create basically the same effect by, you know, just moving it in one direction. Which we can see if we move this around, right? They effectively mirrored it and put it on top of each other. But if I move this, it happens on both sides. It's pretty cool. A lot of what you also see here are ways to potentially like animate your UVs. Like let's say if we wanted to make his eyes pop out, jut out, do something strange, we could potentially do that here. These are his teeth. I think that's really cool. But yeah, this is a tight UV, and I would definitely recommend that if you want to learn more about doing good UVs and even good rigs. I think some of these are rigged. Let's see. Is it Kira here that's rigged? Again, beautiful UVs that are very indicative of Araki's artwork. Just really thoughtfully done here. Having some trouble bringing it in, but I wonder. Let me go to. Yeah, so I actually hid the armatures. So if we go into pose mode, I wonder how much of this. Oh, I see why. So typically rigs don't really translate well from one program to the other. So it's sort of skeletons of your things from one 3D model, 3D modeling sort of program to another usually don't actually line up too well. So we get these sort of messed up rigs here, but they do usually transfer to an engine well. So if we brought this in engine, we'd probably be able to see how we can retarget and and put different animations into here. But yeah, that's just all. This is just a quick little run through on final touches. If you have more questions on any of this, like the lighting here, I don't know, I was playing around with it. It's not perfect lighting. This is like a very ramshackle way of doing 3-point lighting. Just maybe not the best way. But, you know, I was working with what I got. If you're interested in learning more about this, I'm going to post a lot of the links, and probably I'll see if I can put it in the YouTube description, as well as putting it into the Discord chat. But this is basically just a wrap up on the final things I did here. And sort of ways to achieve those techniques. Thank you for watching, y'all. And I hope all your games end up super, super neat.